My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34 years old, and until one Thursday evening in October, I believed the locks on my front door were enough to keep my parents out of my life. I was wrong. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw their gray sedan parked at the curb. They didn't wave. They didn't get out. They waited until I noticed the wrapped box sitting on my doorstep, then they drove away. A white card was tucked beneath the ribbon, 4 words written in my mother's handwriting. "Don't make a scene." I should have left that box untouched. Instead, the warning hit me the same way it always had since I was a kid, like another command I was supposed to obey without question. I carried it into the entryway and cut the ribbon myself. The first thing inside was a photograph of my son asleep in his own bedroom. The second was a spare key to our house. Beneath those sat a thick envelope stamped with the letterhead of a family court attorney. My knees nearly buckled. I called 911 before I even got to the second page. 2 officers arrived within minutes. They separated the contents on our dining table and told me not to touch anything else. That was the moment my husband walked through the front door. He stopped cold at the sight of the uniforms, looked at the open box, and went pale. "Please don't tell me," he whispered. They actually did it. Those words scared me more than the photograph had, because they meant my husband knew something I didn't. Before I tell you what those officers found underneath the paperwork, and why my husband looked like he'd seen a ghost, tell me where you're watching this from, and what time it is where you are right now. I'm always curious how far these stories travel. My husband's name is Ryan. The second those words left his mouth, both officers turned toward him. So did I. For a few seconds, he seemed to be deciding whether to look at me or the box. Finally, he pointed at the envelope and asked if anyone had touched the documents inside. One of the officers said no. Ryan swallowed hard and told us that 3 weeks earlier, my father had asked him to sign something. He said it was framed as an emergency guardianship plan, just in case Ryan and I were ever both hospitalized at the same time. Ryan had refused. I stared at him. He had never once mentioned that conversation to me. Ryan explained that my father, Walter, had cornered him in the parking lot outside his office, speaking in that calm, almost conversational tone he uses when he's discussing something that terrifies everyone else. When Ryan asked why such a document was even necessary, Walter told him that my mother, Diane, believed I had become emotionally unstable, and that someone responsible needed to be ready to step in. Ryan told him to stay away from us. Walter had just smiled and said, "You may not get to make that decision." Ryan had kept it to himself because he thought telling me would tear open wounds I'd spent years trying to close. I wanted to be furious with him. But that box sitting between us was proof that his silence and mine had only given my parents more room to move. The older officer introduced himself as Officer Delgado and pulled on a pair of gloves. Underneath the court envelope, he found a small digital voice recorder, a flash drive, 6 photographs, a wooden toy train, and a stuffed rabbit I recognized immediately. The train belonged to my 7-year-old son, Ollie. The rabbit had gone missing after our last visit to my parents' house, 4 months earlier. When Delgado lifted it out of the box, a familiar floral perfume drifted into the room, my mother's perfume. The same scent that used to linger outside my bedroom door whenever she stood there listening. For one sharp second, I was 17 again, hiding a college acceptance letter under my mattress, because Diane had already decided which school I was going to attend. The photographs were worse. One showed Ollie asleep. Another showed him eating cereal at our kitchen counter. A third had clearly been taken through the chain-link fence behind his school. The date stamps in the corners spanned almost 2 months. In one image, a reflection in a window caught part of the photographer's face. It wasn't Walter. It wasn't Diane. It was a man I had never seen before in my life. Officer Delgado stopped treating this like an ugly family disagreement right then. He called a supervisor, requested an evidence technician, and asked whether my parents had ever had a key to our house. I told him Walter had helped us replace a back door lock the year before. We'd changed the front lock after we cut contact with them, but never got around to the back one. Ryan closed his eyes. Neither of us needed to say what that meant out loud. The envelope held a draft petition asking a court to grant my parents temporary custody of Ollie. Most of it was unsigned, but several attached statements had already been carefully prepared. According to them, I had missed medical appointments, left Ollie unsupervised, threatened relatives, and suffered unpredictable episodes that made our home unsafe. None of it was true. One statement carried what looked exactly like Ryan's signature. He leaned over the page and said flatly, "That's not mine." Another page appeared to be a letter from a therapist I had never met in my life, describing private sessions that never happened and recommending Ollie be removed from my care before, in her words, an avoidable crisis occurred. The language was polished and clinical, which made it so much more frightening, because it had been built to sound reasonable. Delgado asked about the recorder. Ryan recognized the model immediately. 2 months earlier, he'd found one just like it wedged under the passenger seat of our car. He'd assumed it belonged to a coworker who'd carpooled with him once, but when he asked later, the guy said he'd never owned anything like that. Ryan had thrown it in the trash. This one had a strip of black tape on the back and a label that read Kitchen 2. Officer Delgado bagged it without turning it on. "Kitchen 2, he said, suggests there might be a kitchen 1 somewhere." That single sentence changed the temperature of our entire house. The officers asked permission to sweep the house for obvious surveillance devices while they waited on the technician. We said yes immediately. They found a tiny camera tucked inside a smoke detector, angled straight at our kitchen table. Another device was fitted behind an air vent in the hallway right outside Ollie's room. The camera wasn't connected to our Wi-Fi. It stored footage locally on a memory card, which meant whoever installed it had planned on coming back to retrieve it in person. The officers also noticed faint scratch marks around the lock on the back door. I remembered my mother showing up at Ollie's school fundraiser 2 weeks earlier, smiling like our whole estrangement was just a temporary misunderstanding. She'd hugged me before I could step back. At the time, I thought she just wanted to embarrass me in public. Now I wondered if Walter had been inside our house that very afternoon while she kept us occupied outside. The evidence technician photographed everything. Delgado warned us that the forged documents alone didn't prove who had created them, and that family court paperwork could be drafted without ever actually being filed. But he also said the photographs, the duplicate key, and the hidden devices together painted a far more serious picture. He told us not to confront my parents, not to post anything online, and not to tell anyone what we'd found. Then he asked if we had somewhere else to stay that night. Ryan's brother lived on the other side of town, but leaving felt like surrendering our own home. Still, I packed one bag for Ollie and one for the two of us. Ollie was at a friend's supervised birthday sleepover that night, and Ryan arranged for his brother to pick him up without explaining any details over the phone. Before we left, Delgado handed me a property receipt and asked one last question. "Did your parents know your husband would be home late tonight?" I said yes. Diane had called Ryan's office that morning, pretending she was confirming a dinner invitation. Delgado looked at where the box had been placed, then at the open front door. "They may have expected you to open this alone," he said. I finally understood the real message hidden under that ribbon. "Don't make a scene" hadn't been a warning to stay calm. It had been an instruction to stay isolated. As we walked outside, the technician came out of the hallway holding a third evidence bag. Inside was a memory card labeled with my name and a date from 7 years earlier, the same week Ollie was born. We spent that night at Ryan's brother's place, but I didn't sleep. Every creak down the hallway made me picture a key turning in our back door. Ollie was told a pipe had burst and forced us out for the night. He accepted it easily, curled up on the couch, and asked if his grandparents knew where we were staying. It was an innocent question, but it told me exactly how deep Diane had already worked her way into his world. I told him they didn't, then sat beside him until his breathing slowed and evened out. Across the room, Ryan watched me, guilt written across his whole face. Once Ollie was asleep, he apologized for hiding Walter's approach from me. I told him I was hurt, but that I also understood why he'd hesitated. My parents had spent years training everyone around them to manage my reactions, instead of ever confronting their own behavior. That pattern ended that night. The next morning, Detective Delgado called us back down to the station. The memory card labeled with the week of Ollie's birth hadn't come from any device in our current home. It held scanned documents, voice recordings, and photographs collected over 7 years. The earliest recording was a conversation between Diane and me in the hospital right after Ollie was born. I remembered having that conversation. I never knew it had been recorded. Diane had pushed me to sign a temporary medical authorization while I was exhausted from delivery. I'd said no. On the recording, her voice sounds gentle, concerned. After I left the room, Walter's voice comes through. She'll come around once she realizes how little control she actually has. Hearing that sentence years later felt like finding a trapdoor under a floor I'd walked across my whole life. The card also held copies of our tax returns, Ryan's work schedule, Ollie's school calendar, and notes on private arguments Ryan and I had had at home. Most were ordinary details twisted into accusations. A canceled dentist appointment became medical neglect. A babysitter arriving 10 minutes late became child left unsupervised. A photograph of me holding a single glass of wine at a holiday dinner was labeled substance concern. My parents hadn't been documenting danger. They had been manufacturing a story. Delgado introduced us to Detective Priya Nair, who handled stalking and electronic surveillance cases. She was careful not to promise us an arrest. She explained the digital files would need authentication, and the hidden devices would have to be traced back to a source. She also warned us that Walter had already called the department himself. He claimed the box was simply a family archive delivered during a disagreement, and accused me of overreacting because of long-standing emotional issues. He'd even given the name of a retired police captain who could supposedly vouch for what an upstanding member of the community he was. The move was so predictable, it almost made me calm. He hadn't asked whether I was safe. He'd gone straight to controlling the narrative. Detective Nair recommended we change every lock immediately, alert Ollie's school, and file for a temporary restraining order. Our attorney, Rachel Doyle, met with us that same afternoon. She reviewed the fake guardianship petition and caught something the rest of us had missed. The license number listed for the supposed therapist belonged to a real professional, but the name on the letter didn't match the state registry at all. The notary stamp on Ryan's forged signature was genuine too, except it had been reported stolen 3 months earlier. Someone had built this entire file out of pieces of real identities, betting that no one would look closely enough. Rachel advised us not to go anywhere near my parents. Instead, she drafted a formal cease and desist, ordering them to stop contacting us, approaching Ollie's school, entering our property, or accessing our personal records in any way. Ryan wanted to send it immediately. I asked for 10 minutes alone first. In the conference room, I stared at that page and remembered being 22, standing in my parents' kitchen holding an acceptance letter to a graduate program 2 states away. Walter had taken it right out of my hand, folded it in half, and told me the family had already invested enough in my little experiments. Diane cried until I agreed to stay close to home. For years, I told myself that decision had been mine. Admitting the truth felt more humiliating than the lie. Now the same 2 people were trying to turn my entire adult life into another document they could quietly rewrite. I signed the notice. That evening, Detective Nair called with the first real break. A serial number from the hallway camera traced back to a local security equipment store. The buyer had paid in cash, but the store's own surveillance footage showed him clearly, and it was the same unidentified man reflected in the school photograph. His name was Marcus Vale, a private investigator whose license had been suspended following complaints about illegal tracking. Phone records obtained through an emergency request showed repeated contact between Vale and a number registered to Walter's consulting firm. Nair told us not to celebrate yet. Contact alone wasn't proof of a conspiracy, and Vale could easily claim he'd only been hired for lawful observation. Then she added that officers had gone to his listed address and found the office cleared out overnight. An hour later, Diane sent me a voice message. She didn't mention the police or the box at all. She said she'd heard Ollie might be missing school and offered to pick him up until things settled down. Her tone was warm, almost tender. At the very end, her voice dropped and she said, "A judge is going to care about stability, Claire. Think carefully before you make yourself look unstable." I forwarded the message straight to Detective Nair without replying. For the first time in my life, I didn't hear my mother as some all-powerful force. I heard a woman reading from a script. Then Rachel called. The fake emergency petition wasn't just a draft anymore. Someone had actually attempted to file it that morning. That attempt forced everything into the open. Rachel obtained a copy from the courthouse and discovered Walter and Diane were requesting an emergency order before I could even be notified. Their petition claimed Ryan, and I had disappeared with Ollie following a domestic crisis. That police had come to our home because I was behaving irrationally, and that my parents were the only relatives capable of providing immediate stability. They had turned our call for help into evidence against us. Attached were the forged therapist letter, Ryan's false signature, carefully cropped photographs, and a declaration from Marcus Vale, who described himself only as a family safety consultant. The petition asked for temporary guardianship, access to Ollie's school records, and possession of our house keys. Rachel filed an opposition before the assigned judge could act on it. Because the petition alleged immediate risk, the court scheduled an emergency hearing for the following afternoon. Detective Nair couldn't tell the judge what the criminal investigation would eventually conclude, but she provided a sworn statement confirming that hidden cameras, a duplicate key, and suspected forged documents had all been recovered from our home. Officer Delgado's body camera timestamps proved police had responded to evidence we reported, not to any disturbance caused by me. My parents arrived at court dressed like they were headed to a charity luncheon. Diane wore pale blue and held a folder against her chest like a shield. Walter greeted two attorneys in the hallway and nodded to a clerk who seemed to recognize him on sight. When he saw me, he didn't look ashamed or afraid. He looked disappointed, the exact same way he used to look when I brought home a grade he considered beneath me. Diane took one step toward Ollie, who was waiting with Ryan's brother farther down the hall, but a court officer stopped her because of the temporary no-contact order. For just a second, her whole expression shifted. The sweetness dropped away, and something much colder surfaced underneath it. Inside the courtroom, their attorney described them as devoted grandparents responding to alarming information. He called the box a clumsy attempt to share family keepsakes, and claimed the photographs had only been taken to document Ollie's routine because my parents feared neglect. He described the spare key as an old one accidentally left among returned belongings. Every violation became concern. Every lie became a misunderstanding. Then Rachel placed the real, uncropped photographs beside the versions attached to the petition. The originals showed full date stamps and wider backgrounds. One image my parents had labeled Ollie wandering alone outside school showed, once uncropped, Ryan standing only a few feet away the entire time. Another labeled Claire intoxicated at a family gathering showed a birthday toast with 6 other adults all holding identical glasses of wine. The judge asked why the images had been altered. My parents' attorney requested time to confer with his clients. Walter leaned over and whispered something to him, but Diane cut in. She stood up and said she could explain. The judge ordered her to sit down unless called. She kept talking anyway, She said I had always been impulsive, that Ryan was weak, and that someone had to plan responsibly for Ollie's future. She insisted the family couldn't just sit back and wait for me to fall apart. Rachel asked whether Diane had ever authorized anyone to enter our home. Their attorney objected, but the judge allowed a limited answer since the petition itself requested access to our property. Diane looked straight at me and said, "A mother does what's necessary when her daughter refuses help." It wasn't a full confession, but it was enough to shatter the careful image she'd carried into that courtroom. Walter grabbed her arm and told her to stop talking. The judge noticed. So did the court reporter. Rachel then played the voicemail, where Diane warned me that a judge would care about stability. Since Diane had sent it directly to me, there was no consent issue with the recording. The judge listened to it twice. After the second playback, he denied the emergency guardianship request outright, barred my parents from contacting Ollie or approaching his school in any way, and referred the forged documents to the court's fraud unit. He also ordered that no future petition from either of them could be considered without notice to us first. Outside the courtroom, Walter finally lost his composure. He stepped close enough that the court officer moved between us. "You have no idea what you've just started," he said. "People know us. They know exactly what kind of daughter you are. For most of my life, that sentence alone would have silenced me completely." Instead, I answered, "Then let them see the evidence." Diane started crying, though there were no actual tears on her face. She told Ryan he was letting me destroy Ollie's relationship with his own grandparents. Ryan told her they'd destroyed that themselves the moment they broke into our home. Walter's jaw tightened. "You can't prove who entered that house," he snapped. Detective Nair, who'd been waiting near the elevators the whole time, spoke up from behind him. "We're working on that." Walter turned and saw her badge. For the first time, every ounce of his confidence drained out of his face. Nair asked both of my parents to come down to the station voluntarily. Their attorney refused on their behalf and hurried them away. As they stepped into the elevator, Diane stared at me with open hatred. The doors closed, but not before she lifted her phone and started typing something. Less than 5 minutes later, every relative in our extended family received a message from her claiming I'd suffered a breakdown, manipulated the police, and tried to have my own loving parents arrested. What Diane didn't realize was that she'd attached the wrong file. Underneath her message sat a photograph of our kitchen, taken directly from the hidden camera. She tried to delete it from the group chat, but too many people had already downloaded the attachment by then. My cousin sent me a screenshot before I'd even made it out of the parking garage. The photo showed our kitchen from the exact angle of the camera, hidden inside our smoke detector. In the corner, a timestamp placed it 3 weeks before that box ever showed up on our doorstep. Diane had just connected herself directly to the same evidence she'd insisted was all a misunderstanding. Detective Nair asked everyone who'd received the message to preserve the original file. By that evening, the court's fraud investigator, the district attorney's office, and the police cyber unit were all examining the exact same photograph. The embedded metadata showed it had been exported from a folder titled Claire Home Monitoring. The device history traced that folder back to a laptop registered to Walter's consulting company. He could still argue someone else had used the computer, but the wall around him had already started to crack. The next morning, officers executed search warrants at my parents' house and at Walter's office. Detective Nair only told us what the law allowed her to share. They recovered copies of our house key invoices from Marcus Vale, a stolen notary seal, surveillance equipment, and several binders labeled with dates going back to my childhood. One binder held reports on Ryan's job, our neighbors, Ollie's teachers, and members of my extended family who might support or oppose my parents in a dispute. Another held drafts of anonymous complaints prepared for Ollie's school, Ryan's employer, and child welfare services. Not all of them had been sent, but together they showed a coordinated plan. Isolate us. Damage our credibility. then present themselves as the only solution. Marcus Vale was found 2 days later at a motel outside a neighboring county. Faced with records tying him directly to the cameras and photographs, he agreed to cooperate. He admitted Walter had paid him to surveil our home and install the recording devices. He also said Diane had supplied him with our schedules and had deliberately distracted us during the school fundraiser. Vale claimed he'd never agreed to go inside Ollie's actual bedroom, but digital evidence placed one of his devices there regardless. His attempt to protect himself only handed investigators more detail. My parents were arrested the following week. Walter faced charges including residential burglary, stalking, conspiracy, forgery, and identity misuse. Diane faced many of the same charges, plus attempted fraud on the court. Their attorney released a statement calling the arrests an unfortunate criminalization of a private family disagreement. That statement lasted less than a day before local reporters obtained the court filing and portions of the public record. The social fallout came fast. Walter was placed on leave from the nonprofit board he'd chaired for over a decade. 2 organizations quietly removed his name from upcoming events. Diane's church committee asked her to step back while the case was pending. Friends who had once accepted her version of events started forwarding us old messages where she'd asked strangely specific questions about our schedule, our marriage, and Ollie's school. Each forwarded message became another thread in the same pattern. I didn't celebrate their humiliation. I was too busy trying to understand the full scale of what they'd built. Rachel helped us file a civil suit for invasion of privacy, emotional distress, trespassing, and the cost of securing our home. We replaced every lock, every camera, every computer, every phone. Ryan changed his entire work routine. Ollie's school added photographs of my parents to its restricted contact list. The expenses were enormous, but for the first time, every step we took created distance instead of fear. Diane was released before trial under strict conditions, ordered not to contact us directly or indirectly. Walter had to surrender his passport and lost access to any company devices. Through relatives, they kept insisting they'd only acted out of love. I gave the same answer every single time. Love doesn't require forged signatures, hidden cameras, or a stolen key. 3 weeks later, a flower arrangement showed up at Ryan's brother's house. No sender's name. The card read, "Families forgive." Detective Nair traced the purchase to a prepaid card, but store footage showed Diane standing right at the register. It was a deliberate violation of the no-contact order. Nair arrested her again that same afternoon. As Diane was led out of the courthouse after her release was revoked, she spotted me across the lobby. She didn't plead. She didn't pretend. She just mouthed 4 words. "You did this to us." I finally understood the difference between guilt and responsibility. I hadn't done this to them. I had simply stopped shielding them from the consequences of what they'd already done. The criminal case took nearly a year to reach its conclusion. My parents used every legal delay available to them the entire time. Walter changed attorneys twice. Diane requested medical accommodations, then showed up at social events telling people the charges were destroying her health. Their supporters wrote letters describing them as generous, respectable people who had devoted their whole lives to family. The prosecutor answered with photographs of the hidden devices, payment records, the forged documents, and Diane's own message containing the hidden camera photo. The binders taken from their house revealed something even more personal. For years, Walter had kept copies of letters addressed to me. Among them was the original acceptance packet from the graduate program I thought I'd turned down myself. A second letter showed the program had actually offered me financial aid after I asked to defer for a year. I had never once seen it. Diane had called the admissions office, pretending to be me, and withdrawn my application permanently. Another folder held emails Walter had sent to an old boyfriend of mine, warning him I was unstable and would ruin his career if he stayed with me. My parents hadn't started controlling me the day Ollie was born. They had simply expanded a system that had already worked on me for most of my life. Rachel asked if I wanted those details included in our civil case. I said yes, not because any court could hand back the opportunities they'd stolen from me, but because I was finished helping them preserve a false version of our history. Ryan read every document alongside me. Some days I felt furious. Other days I felt almost nothing at all. The hardest moments were the ones where I recognized my own old words being repeated back through Diane, that I was too sensitive, too impulsive, too dependent to make any major decision on my own. I had spent years describing myself in my mother's language. We told Ollie only what fit his age. We said his grandparents had broken serious rules, that adults were handling it, and that none of it was his fault. He asked if they still loved him. I told him I believed they felt something they called love, but that love without respect can slowly turn into possession. He got quiet, then said he just didn't want anyone taking pictures through his window ever again. That one simple sentence ended up becoming part of the impact statement Rachel helped us prepare for sentencing. As the trial approached, Marcus Vale agreed to testify. Forensic evidence showed his equipment had entered our home on multiple separate occasions. Phone location records placed Walter nearby during 2 of those entries, while Diane's own messages proved she'd arranged the distractions. The forged therapist letter was traced back to a template found on Walter's laptop. Ryan's copied signature had been lifted from an old contractor agreement. The stolen notary seal turned up locked in a drawer in Diane's sewing room. Faced with all of it, both of my parents accepted plea deals. Walter pleaded guilty to residential burglary, stalking, conspiracy, and forgery. Diane pleaded guilty to stalking, conspiracy, attempted fraud on the court, and violating the protective order. At sentencing, Walter asked the judge to weigh his years of service to the community. The judge told him that kind of public trust made his conduct more serious, not less. Walter received a multi-year prison sentence, followed by supervised release. Diane received a county sentence, intensive probation, mandatory treatment, and a long-term protective order forbidding any contact with us. The court also ordered restitution to cover our security costs and legal fees. Their financial standing collapsed right along with the case. Walter's firm lost its major clients and shut down completely. Their insurer refused to cover any of it, citing intentional misconduct. To cover legal fees, restitution, and our civil settlement, they were forced to sell the house I grew up in. The nonprofit removed Walter permanently and issued a public apology to its donors. Diane lost the entire social circle she had once used as an audience for her version of our family. On sentencing day, she turned toward me and whispered, "Was it worth destroying everything?" I answered quietly, "I didn't destroy anything. I just opened the box." That was the last direct conversation we ever had. A year after sentencing, our house no longer felt like a place under watch. We'd replaced the back door, repaired the hallway vent, and swapped out the smoke detector twice before I finally stopped glancing at it every time I walked into the kitchen. Healing never showed up as one big dramatic moment. It came in ordinary things, leaving my phone on the counter without checking for messages, watching Ollie walk into school without scanning the parking lot first, disagreeing with Ryan without hearing my father's voice in the back of my head predicting our marriage would fail. Ryan and I worked through the silence that had grown between us two. He promised he would never again protect me by withholding information, and I promised to tell him when old fear was quietly shaping a new decision. We went to counseling, not because my parents' forged letter had somehow been right about me, but because real support is something you choose, something honest and accountable. That distinction mattered enormously to me. Diane had used the idea of mental health as a weapon. I refused to let her turn asking for help into something shameful. The civil settlement covered our remaining security costs and set up an education fund for Ollie. I didn't want money from my parents to feel like some kind of reward, so we treated it as restoration instead. Part of the settlement also required them to surrender every photograph, recording, spare key, and document connected to us. Detective Nair personally supervised the transfer. There were 12 boxes in total. I didn't open most of them. Rachel arranged for a digital forensics company to pull anything necessary for our records and destroy the rest. One small envelope was returned to me separately because it held my original graduate school acceptance letter. I held onto it for a long time. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but my name was still perfectly clear. At 35, I applied to a local graduate program in the same field. When the acceptance email finally landed in my inbox, I read it out loud to Ryan and Ollie. No one took it out of my hands this time. Extended family reacted in all kinds of ways. Some apologized for ever believing Diane. Others said they just wanted to stay neutral, as if hidden cameras and forged court documents were simply two sides of an ordinary disagreement. I stopped arguing with them. Neutrality had always been the exact space my parents operated best inside. Anyone who needed me to soften the truth just to preserve family peace no longer had a central place in my life. Ollie eventually asked if he'd ever see his grandparents again. I told him the protective order would stay in place, and that when he was older, he could talk through his own feelings about it with us and with qualified professionals. I never asked him to hate them. Hatred would have just kept them present in a different shape. I wanted him to understand boundaries, evidence, and the real difference between forgiveness and access. Forgiveness can belong entirely to you. Access has to be earned. Some people call what happened to my parents revenge. I understand why. Walter lost his freedom, his business, his home, and his reputation. Diane lost her social standing, her control over our family, and the audience that used to accept every story she ever told. Their punishment was severe. But I never planted evidence, never spread a single rumor, never engineered their downfall. I only preserved what they sent us, reported what they'd done, and refused to back down when they tried to make me doubt my own memory. The truth simply created consequences they'd spent years successfully avoiding. That wrapped box stayed in police evidence until the case fully closed. When it was finally released back to me, I only asked for one thing back, the warning card. I framed it right beside my graduate school acceptance letter. "Don't make a scene now" hangs beneath proof that I reclaimed a decision they once stole from me a long time ago. Those words don't sound like an order anymore. They remind me of the exact moment my obedience finally ended. So here's the lesson I carried away from that doorstep. When controlling people tell you to stay quiet, they're usually protecting the exact story that gives them power over you. Document the facts. Ask for help. Build boundaries that actually have consequences attached to them. And never confuse family loyalty with permission to invade your life. Would you have opened that box yourself or called the police before ever touching it? Either way, trust the moment concern quietly turns into control. That moment might just be the beginning of your freedom.